So hey anime fans, the series name is What If Naruto Trained by Indra Otsutsuki. So let's start the series. The thing that has enormous power is that, eventually, it begins to become aware of its tremendous size and, like everything else, wants to remain that way. Preservation is a powerful thing. Therefore, Uchiha Madara didn't realize that he was combining Senju Hashirama's cells when he did so. Madara and Hashirama were actually reincarnations of the transmigrant chakra of Azura and Indra Otsutsuki, the children of Hagoromo Otsutsuki, who is known as the Rakudo Sannin. Therefore, Madara was able to awaken extraordinary power in the form of the mythical Rinnegan by fusing the chakras of Azura and Indra. The Uchiha Patriarch was unaware that combining such powers would make it impossible to control what it did. The cycle should have continued after the Uchiha's death, with Azura and Indra reincarnating as they had since they died. However, power does not want to fade away once it becomes aware of its path, so Indra's chakra did the only thing it could: it attacked. When the transmigrant chakras fought in the little blonde host, Indra's only desire was dominance. If Indra could take all of his little brother's power, he would feel even more alive than he did with just a small portion of it. All he had to do was defeat Azura, absorb his power, and then wait for his destined body to be born. Sounds easy, doesn't it? Nothing is ever easy. He had died, chosen to die, and he did not want to be treated like a god, even though he was the closest thing to being divine and all-powerful. He had fulfilled his dream and his job, and he had left the world to its own devices. The brothers were unaware that their struggle of wills was gradually bringing something that was never meant to return to this world. Did he have to leave the world of the living and have faith in humanity? No, he didn't. However, he decided to grant them their freedom and let his body to perish like everyone else. He had laughed at the moment, considering that he had been essentially a god all of his existence, and that he was now choosing to depart it as a human. An immortal mortal, what nonsense! Even though he didn't understand how his children's chakra was calling forth his own, he couldn't think of a reason to try to stop it, even if he could. He had witnessed the world after he had left it, and having children was not his legacy, so he allowed it to take him when he felt the gentle yet firm pull. He laughed again, and whatever force was trying to resuscitate him approached with fear. Was he really that frightening? If they only knew that he was the most modest, kind, and charming guy ever made, they wouldn't treat him like a deity, which he wasn't. Yes, the horns weren't common, but that didn't make him a demon, quite the opposite. Sort of, after giving it some thought, he was excited about the prospect of seeing his other 9 children again. He didn't spend much time with them the first time, and he was somewhat aware that his creations had been mistreated since he left. There was a story about sealing them into children to make soldiers. People at the time treated them like mindless monsters and put them on leashes like pets. He intended to alter that. It took a lot to get the serene and quiet guy angry, but once he did, nothing was more scary than a godlike man who could wipe out the entire world if he so desired. What was even more terrifying was that, to him, it would be simple, and nothing could evade his judgment. Yet another laugh. He made the moon. When he finally reached his goal and put an end to the argument between his children, everything literally stopped. His will was the strongest in the world. It was omniscient and omnipotent. He decided that he had spent enough time simply watching them, so he absorbed all of Azura's chakra and then all of Indra's. He also felt one of his creations nearby, the strongest of them if the enormity was any indication. The god-man simply felt their presence for a moment, forgetting their needless and incredibly redundant fighting for the memory of their childhood, when they were still his innocent children, loving and caring, even Indra. A smile came to his face. He truly missed his children, all of them. He was always willing to cooperate when he could, and his conviction that love was the path to peace was one of the reasons he was chosen to be Ninshu's successor. Azura had never resisted. In fact, he had accepted his father's overwhelming pull. He always trusted his father, knowing that even if he wanted to, he could not stand against him, and not even the gods themselves would dare deny him. However, Indra made an effort to resist. He wanted all the power for himself, as usual, and he wanted people to view him the same way they did his father, with 6 parts fear and 4 parts respect. He was infuriated that no matter how hard he tried, he would never be able to match the power he knew his father possessed. It was absurd. How could a man get so fucking strong? He was so strong that everyone knew he had long since transcended the world of mortals and become a god. He couldn't understand why he allowed himself to die like a helpless mortal. It obeyed his father's commands as usual, and Indra assimilated into him with little to no effort. He paused for a final time, allowing his whole being to synchronize with the wailing infant. He had a dim memory of the man and woman who had just passed away, and he assumed they were his parents. It's a shame, since he would have liked to have known them. Additionally, he sensed Kurama's presence within himself, which caused him to feel both happy and angry, 2 emotions he didn't like having. He was happy that he had become so close to one of his children so quickly, and he was angry that one of his sons had been imprisoned once more. Once he was able to change that, he had a plan, locate his kids and bring them back. They would be secure with him, and he would ensure that they never had to experience the suffering, isolation, and hatred they were now experiencing, and restore the tranquility for which he had fought so hard during his final days on Earth. He was someone new, in a new world, at least to him, and everything had changed. He was going to change everything even more. It was his destiny. He even felt that his new self was the same as his old one. The birth of the child of prophecy, the Rikudo Sennin, had returned. The second arrival of peace was approaching. He misjudged the corruption and vileness of this world, which was infected with shinobi. Everything was cloaked in lies and secrecy, and nobody could be trusted, which made him feel deeply sick. He was 6 years old now, and his life was already filled with a lot of suffering. To start, he was the village's Jinchuriki, a title that disgusted him because he was not a human sacrifice and his children were not these demons, as the villagers called them. He had seen real demons and even fought them, but they were nothing like his children. The idea of it was utterly foolish. Was he really the only one who thought it was absurd? However, he was the bearer of the fabled dojutsu, the Rinnegan. He had anticipated that his eyes would become legendary, and that some extremes would worship him as a god even after his death. But what actually transpired was a little unsettling. His name was only mentioned in fervent fables about a man-turned-god who blessed humanity with his divine assistance. Was this ridiculousness, once more, just that to him? Indeed, some of his actions that have persisted to this day were unthinkable, even divine, but was it really so difficult to accept that he was a human? The stories Kurama told him before he went to sleep were all he really needed to know, that there were people who had gone before him who had accomplished impossible feats, and he had personally seen some of the things his youngest son's reincarnations had done, one of the major ones being Senju Hashirama. His Mokutan skill was incredible, and he was able to do the magnificent, "Why then, did people find it so difficult to accept that he created the moon? He concluded that the people of this era were simply ignorant. His current circumstances, which included his 6-year-old body sitting in the large seat of the Konoha council chambers with his feet swinging back and forth, reinforced his decision. It had become commonplace for the shinobi to discuss shinobi matters that, in their deranged minds, involved him. Why were they holding these frequent meetings? When he was first told about the Shinobi Academy, the Hokage boasted about how strong he could become if he joined the ranks. The old Sarutobi expected a big smile and childish comments, but instead he received a nasty snort followed by a dismissive scoff. Uzumaki Naruto, as he was now known, vehemently refused to enroll in the academy with a fervor as hot as the will of fire. He had to consider the ridiculous stupidity of that. The boy's unusually cold reaction to the idea of becoming a shinobi was dismissed by the Hokage, an elderly man named Sarutobi Hiruzen, as childish stubbornness. However, when he brought up the idea again, Naruto rejected it outright, vehemently stating that the shinobi life was a corrupted life, and he wanted nothing to do with it. The elderly warrior couldn't explain why he was so opposed to the idea. The council then intervened, and a man by the name of Shimura Danzo demanded that the youngster be given to him. Naruto laughed when it was mentioned that Danzo could force the boy to cooperate, saying he would like to see the old goat try. He shook his head, his thoughts growing bitter and a little gloomy. He didn't like the feeling he got when he thought about shinobi and the council, but he couldn't help it. His host had a tendency to magnify one emotion, and he was either extremely happy or extremely depressed. He had been spending hours meditating and trying to calm his emotions, and it had been very helpful. Prior to his last birthday, he wanted nothing more than to lash out at anyone who looked at him with contempt. However, he had calmed his mind through training and meditation, and he had determined that 6 was the right age to start his physical training. He didn't have the strength or muscles to fight an adult yet, but he wouldn't get there without starting somewhere. He sighed again. "They have no idea what my eyes could do," he said, laughing to himself, as he heard an elderly woman support Danzo's idea of forced cooperation. These people truly wanted the power they believed his eyes possessed, but he hadn't shown them anything yet. They also had very vivid imaginations. He missed his wife in these situations because she was so outspoken and knew how to handle them. Everyone would either intentionally talk over him or ignore him completely, and if Suki were present, she would scare the living daylights out of them before reprimanding them for their rude behavior. When she was done, she would let him say what he needed to say, and most of the time he wouldn't have to because she would say everything he wanted to say during her tirade. The thought of his wife made him smile, and her memory illuminated the gloom he felt for the shinobi world. The Hokage cleared his throat before speaking. "Uzumaki Naruto, I take it that you still refuse to enroll in the Shinobi Academy?" Naruto nodded, and Hiruzen scowled and inhaled deeply before responding. "I see, that is very unfortunate," as if he disagreed with what he was about to say due to the halting of the whispers. And he did, he was very, very against what he was going to say. According to his alleged friend Danzo, he was jeopardizing the well-being of not just Kanehigakure no Sato, but of Hai no Kuni, by not forcing the Jinchuriki to join the shinobi ranks. Hiruzen was surprised, but the outcome was even more so. It seemed that the daimyo's personal guard had openings that needed to be filled, and he was eager and interested in claiming the boy for the Shinobi Guardian 12. Nothing was official yet, but Konoha was to expect the fire daimyo within 6 months, ready to present the boy, Naruto simply sighed. He knew that Hiruzen, to a certain degree, cared for him and wanted the best for him. He also knew that the elderly man from his village and his country had been under a great deal of stress due to his refusal to become a shinobi, and it saddened him that the man had to endure such hardships because of him. However, he couldn't give in and adopt something so unattractive for the sake of one man. His beliefs were very important to him and defined him. It had caused him to seriously doubt not only himself but also humanity as a whole because, even after achieving peace and understanding, they still craved nothing but war and suffering. Ninjutsu was a perversion of Nishu, something created for the sole purpose of taking another life. Making a weapon out of a tool for peace and understanding was the ultimate betrayal. It was an eye-opener that he really did not want to see. He questioned whether his belief in peace was really a naive ideal because, despite all of his sacrifices and hard effort, it wasn't adequate or effective. Had his faith in the prospect of harmonious human coexistence been a naive impossibility? He was afraid of that line of thinking because of the somewhat terrible conclusions he would draw, not because he wished to abandon humanity. Was his mother correct? His mother, Otsutsuki Kagayahime, the princess who ate the fruit of the god tree, had started to gently demand that people worship her, governing over them like a queen or goddess. Had she realized that people couldn't maintain the calm she had brought about? Had she been able to perceive their heart's blackness before he had? Had she made the decision that she would have to subjugate them and eventually rule over them in order to save them from themselves? It frightened him because it made so much logic in a way he had never seen before. The fire daimyo will be in Konoha in 6 months, and he has asked to meet with you, the Hokage said solemnly, not wanting Minato's child to be taken from the village. Do you understand, Naruto-kun? He asked. Hi, Naruto said, nodding, not really caring who wanted to meet with him. Since he was a priest and a sage and not a murderer or a shinobi, he understood that this meeting would be used to try to persuade him to join the shinobi ranks. But he also knew it would be ineffective. You are free to go then, Hiruzen replied, and he smiled sadly when Naruto let out a huge, childlike sigh and virtually leaped from his seat, running to the doorway, grateful for the permission. Underscore 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 underscore. In his previous life, Naruto had never brooded because he thought it was a needless use of his facial muscles. But lately, with the council on his back, it had become commonplace. He didn't hate shinobi, but his general distaste for the creation and, consequently, the corruption of Nishu to ninjutsu made him a little resentful of those who adopted it. It was astounding to think that anything remained of the world and humanity after all the warring and conflict brought about by the shinobi lifestyle. How boys grew old enough to become men, lovers, husbands, fathers, and husbands. It was almost miraculous. How girls lived long enough to become women, lovers, wives, and mothers. He was certain that it was due to divine intervention, because everywhere he saw death, pain, despair, destruction, and evil. It was heartbreaking. It was both sad and maddening to have most people in the globe spit in your face and reject the peace you give. Were all of his alleged accomplishments and his better tomorrow rhetoric in vain? Had he not sacrificed all for the world? Had he failed to battle the world's demons? Had he not taken an iron fist stance against the despots who sought to control the weak? He had introduced people to a better way of living, hadn't he? For the sole purpose of protecting them, had he not battled the deity of utter destruction? After he and his Otsutsuki nearly killed several times to save those who were unable to defend themselves, he concluded that they would never be able to live in harmony without understanding. So what did he do? In the hopes that those who were unable to preserve themselves would no longer face that difficulty, he shared his strength and values with them, gave them that insight, and granted them equality. What had they done with that? They turned it into a weapon, disfigured it, and used it to kill people and make it easier to harm others. In his 5th year back on this planet, he had concluded that the jutsu these shinobi used was a terrible scourge, a plague on the people he had once fought so hard for. It occasionally made him cry, and his tears grew when he heard the stories Kurama had told him. One story in particular made him feel completely ill, and then enraged. Underscore 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 underscore. He was too exhausted to even eat after a hard day of training his youthful body. But he grinned because he could never be too exhausted to talk to his son. He closed his eyes, and the world of hate and contempt vanished. His purple, ringed eyes opened as if he had never closed them in the first place, and he grinned genuinely and purely as he looked at the tall figure. He had grown accustomed to the bars that held his son captive, and had already promised that, once he had the ability, he would tear the cage to pieces. He had also assured his child that, once his eyes were fully grown, he would never again see a cage. Not as a child, but as the Rikudo Sennin, as Uzumaki Naruto. That was his word, his pledge. The tall figure snarled at the figure in front of him, bending to get as close as he could. They talked non-stop, every day, as often as they could, yet he still couldn't get enough. Kurama grinned. Most people would find it odd to see the most powerful bijou in the world smile with such joy, but he wasn't most. He wasn't a stranger, an observer, or a haughty fool. "Hello, father," Kurama said with joy, glad to see his father again despite their recent 2-hour conversation. "Hello, Kurama," Naruto said. He was clearly happy to talk to his son again and found that, in a village full of people who hated him, talking to his son was the only good thing he had. He also discovered that, as long as Kurama remained by his side, he would never be alone. "You promised to tell me the tale of my father," he said with a smile on his face. Namikaze Minato was a strong, pure man who valued love and peace above all else. The Yondaime Hokage had been a man who wished for peace in a world full of hate, and his wish for peace extended not only to Konoha but to all nations. He had killed many people, but he dreamed of a time when no one died at the hands of another's blade. He was a hero, a true, selfless hero, who thought his son would be the one to bring the peace he so desperately needed. If only he were aware of his accuracy. "While I was sealed within the woman who would become his wife, I only heard whispers of his name, occasionally leaving the tongues of those around her, her own tongue using his name." Kurama began the night's story, incredibly happy that he had this time. He had loved his father, more than his siblings, in his mind. They only had a short time with him, and then, like everything in the world, he was gone, choosing to let humanity live on their own. By the time she became his mate, he already had an incredible reputation. His father had been human, but the mortality of humanity meant nothing to someone with the power that rivaled the very gods that created him. He had been hurt that his father had left him, all alone in a world that saw him as nothing but hatred and a means to power. I wasn't able to hear much, but what I did hear made me almost feel as if he was the one you spoke of that time. He had later decided that his father leaving was a good idea. The way things turned out, it was something that his father would feel heartache for. The world turned his gifts into weapons, and that, in his mind, was the greatest disrespect the world had ever shown. He had been particularly popular for his slaughter of an IWA army. With a startled expression on his face and a frown, Naruto said, "Slaughter? I thought he was a hero, a peaceful man." He seemed a little perplexed. "He wished for peace, father," Kurama said, his deep voice making the cages that held him tremble. "But in a world like this, peace isn't really an actual option," he said. Yes, it was for the best that his father had left, or he would have felt pain, and despair that, when he even considered that his father felt it, made him angry enough to want to destroy the world entirely. There was a war, one of the world wars these shinobi have caused 3 times already. To save his people, his home, he had to go against everything he believed, everything he wished for. Kurama said his biggest lie. He had claimed to have hated humanity his entire life, but that was his biggest lie. His father was human, regardless of how godlike he was, and when it came to love, his father had every last drop that was in his heart. In seconds, an army, 1,000 strong, fell by his blade, Kurama said. Even though he didn't like it, Naruto's eyes widened at the prospect that a guy without sight could kill so many people in a matter of seconds. It was a little scary. I, however, was able to hear his side of things, his take of his heroic deed. On the war front, he continued. He was called a hero, the person who practically ended the war single-handedly. His father should have been worshipped and placed on a gilded throne for his sacrifices. But instead he was betrayed and forgotten to become nothing more than a legend and a fairy tale. When his son started telling his story, Naruto sat down, crossed his legs, and settled in. He leaned in, his body already halfway through the enormous gates that held his kid captive, and asked, "How did he feel, son?" He knew his father saw him and all the Bija as his children, but it always felt good to be reminded that you had a place in someone's heart, and that you were loved. The Yandame Hokage had gone to his wife afterwards, seeking to be consoled after losing one of his students. The pain of that loss obviously hurt him, but he managed to get through it with only shedding a single tear. Kurama said, wishing his father had everything he had ever dreamed of, and that now that he was back, he would assist him with everything he asked of him. His chakra? He could have it all, his loyalty, and he thought it was his father's anyway. He didn't even need to inquire because Kurama was devoted to just one entity, the Rakudo Sannin. Who was his love? He loved his father, and no one else. But when he got around to talking about his awe-inspiring slaughter, he had done something my container, your mother, had never seen or heard before, he said. His father may have taken on a different form, but he was certain that this boy was the host of his father, the host of the most powerful man to walk the earth. He was Otsutsuki Hagoromo, regardless of the name he went by now. He cried for hours. He had been sick after what he had done. He had been sick after what he had been forced to take the lives of 1,000 men and women in a matter of seconds, all for the sake of peace for his home, he said. He was only able to improve his people and his village, but the fact that he wanted peace for all villages and all people made Naruto proud to be Namake's Minato's son. His father became something of a personal hero in Naruto's mind, and they were alike. Kurama was silent for a moment, letting his father think. The next day, your mother, Uzumaki Kushina, asked him a certain question that, even I have to admit, was unexpected. This was the answer that had him thinking that maybe, just maybe, this Namake's Minato was his father's legacy. She asked if he had the chance to take it back, to never have done it, would he take it? It still made him chuckle softly to himself, not that anyone else but his father would know that. And he had said, with a determination as hot as the sun itself, that he would do it over and over again, for eternity even, if he had to, because, as a shinobi, in the shinobi world, where the darkness prevails, there absolutely had to be a light, a hope that had to do what needed to be done, for the sake of not just one village, but for the sake of all villages. He had believed that, with him sacrificing his soul, his beliefs, and killing those shinobi, he had ended the war, the struggle, and hopefully that would save the lives of 100,000. He had believed that, with the deaths of those 1,000, and his beliefs, he had helped save all the nations from each other. At first, Kurama saw it as a foolish hero act, but after thinking about it, it made so much sense. Tears streamed down his tiny face as he said, he was a hero. And his voice was brimming with sincere emotion. He believed that, if he forfeited his personal peace, he could give peace to others. His father was ill from the suffering and the sacrifice he had to make because it was the only thing he could do in this sinister, deranged shinobi world. After that, it infuriated him. Underscore 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 as he walked home, Naruto sighed and kicked a small rock with his foot. He didn't like the council because, in addition to being shinobi, they had made his father make those difficult decisions. It was the only way he could think of to help bring peace to the nations, and even though it had cost thousands of lives, Naruto had commended his father. It wasn't an easy task, though, and the shinobi world made sure of it. He continued to walk with his eyes ringed, watching the burnt orange sky above him. He blamed his host for this. He had a strange obsession with the color orange, and he had almost purchased this dreadfully ugly orange jumpsuit because he really liked it. He had occasionally found himself acting in such a childish manner, such as wanting to play a practical joke on everyone who had ever looked at him. He would then have to stop, take a deep breath, and remind himself that he was not the adult he believed himself to be. His body was still that of a 6-year-old, and regardless of his soul's age, he was still technically 6. Well, the hardships of being a supreme being resurrected into a time period that was little more than 1,000 years below his own, he sighed. That kind of made him laugh since the idea was so ridiculous, incredible even, but it was real. He sighed again and shook his head as he saw the dilapidated, old structure he called home. His father had been the Yandame Hokage, a man who was cherished by everyone of Hai no Kuni. Why was he living in what morons preferred to call an apartment? Since the entire village couldn't possibly be that foolish, he was starting to believe that everyone in Konoha was blind. He opened his door without locking it. Why would anyone want to break into his home when no one wanted to interact with him on the streets? That way of thinking was shattered as an uninvited guest sat at his makeshift kitchen table. The older boy turned to face him, his ocean blue eyes meeting his black onyx ones. I know who you are, the lad with the shoulder-length black hair said. Uzumaki Naruto. After a little period of silence, Naruto's face appeared as though he had consumed something excessively sour. Eh? In its most basic form, what he was seeing was impossible. Since he had been paired with the boy 2 months prior, he had sensed that Uzumaki Naruto was unusual. True, his Rinnegan eyes were unusual. The sage's eyes should only have ever belonged to the sage. But that wasn't the reason he thought the blonde was different, nor were his whisker-like birthmarks, which were also unusual, the reason he thought the child was different. No, these things were merely physical, and he liked to look beneath the surface. He discovered that by examining what was hidden behind what was visible, one could actually see the colors of another person. No child, not even himself at that age, walked with that much almost palpable, non-arrogant pride and confidence. Each step the boy took seemed to have purpose, like everything was important, every breath, every blink of the eye, everything. It was slightly hypnotizing, addicting, and so very absurd. As a 6-year-old boy, Naruto shouldn't have the presence that outshined the Hokage, but here he was, almost instinctively watching over his charge, not because he was told to, but because it was the right thing to do, the only thing to do. This is what brought him here, in a very isolated area of the village that was covered with trees and bushes, out of sight of others. He was an ANBU agent, and as such, he was supposed to know every inch of the village, but there was still a place he had never seen. The person he was sworn to protect was sitting on the grassy ground, his purple, ringed eyes closed in intense concentration, and he watched through crimson eyes as the village Jinchuriki, as the people called him, raised his left hand. He saw through crimson eyes as, with a sudden spike of chakra, the boy's left hand lit up in a red flame. The red was not very much, but he was able to identify what it was. It was pure, clean chakra, the likes of which should have been impossible to not only create, but also manipulate at all. The tiny flame extinguished like a candle in the wind after its creator let out a frustrated sigh. Focusing once more, he raised his right hand and, as before, it ignited, this time turning blue. He could also see that the blue flame was yang chakra. The flame extinguished, causing the boy to pout slightly. Who else might he have been talking to when he started talking to himself because he wasn't that close to the blonde? He could only hear 2 words that came out of the boy's mouth since he was unable to hear what was being spoken. 2 words, whispered into existence, shouldn't have had the weight and magnitude of the words that left his charge's tongue. It was as if they held power that no sentence or truly complex speech could ever carry. Normally, 2 words wouldn't be very significant at all. They couldn't make up an entire sentence, adequately explain a situation, or accomplish much of anything. When he heard these 2 words, these 2 living expressions, his heart stopped. He couldn't be certain because, after all, it was a completely ludicrous theory. These tales were children's stories, the kind that parents told before bed. He may have been young, the youngest since the legendary Hatake Kakashi, but he wasn't an innocent, naive child. He took pride in knowing history, not just of his village but of the entire world. His insight and bigger picture didn't just include Konohagakure. He knew his village was equally guilty of the terrible monstrosities that shinobi tend to impose on others. All of this was done in the name of peace and patriotic duty. But for what purpose? He had been traumatized by the horrors of the Third Shinobi World War, and contrary to what his family believed, it wasn't just because of the Konoha-born, as the mangled, shredded bodies of the enemies brought back as trophies and claims to fame through conquest were just as bad. The men they brought back were someone's son, someone's family. The women were someone's daughter, someone's kin, and he was able to study world history and witness both sides of the conflict, and what he witnessed left him scarred. Even though many would disagree, he had concluded that peace would not be feasible for the shinobi world since it wounded his heart just as much to witness their dead bodies. War, starvation, death, desire, gluttony, and greed were only a few of the regular occurrences in the shinobi world, and only Rikudo Sennin himself could reverse them all. His body was almost designed for the life of an assassin, a killer, or a murderer, and he detested his so-called talents and his so-called genius. He was a pacifist, a loving child who wanted nothing but peace and understanding, but he was cursed with a prodigious talent for the shinobi arts, and he had the ability to take lives with ease that an experienced veteran had at an early age. He had risen through the ranks of the shinobi ranks more quickly than any of his generation. He had believed that nothing would change and that as long as shinobi governed the world, the cycle of hatred he knew would never end. He felt as though the never-ending cycle of hatred and the unending bloodshed that shinobi brought upon the earth like a plague may end when he heard those two words leave the blonde, Rinnegan-wielding boy's mouth. Before he faced this, he needed to be really certain, learn more, and study. The weasel-masked ANBU agent needed only those two words to restore his faith in humanity. He could hear those two words and would always remember them. Banbutsu Sozo. Underscore 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 underscore. You are the Rikudo Sennin, I know you are, Uchiha Itachi said, sitting with the blonde and a cup of steaming tea. After studying the Uchiha documents, what little we still have of you, I had my answer, my confirmation, he said, pausing with desperate-looking eyes. You have to be, he continued. This boy, this Uchiha Itachi, was just like his father, just like Namikaze Minato, a single, solitary light that shone in the darkness that was the shinobi world. Naruto stared at one of his eldest son's descendants with a stoic, almost cold expression on his face. He let the boy talk because he wanted to hear what ridiculous acquisition he had come up with. But now he was a little surprised because he never imagined that anyone could share his thoughts on the shinobi world. He was interested and asked, "And if I were this man, the sage reincarnated, what would you have me do?" With his grim face and his ebony eyes never leaving the purple ones, Itachi remained motionless as he considered his response. "What I want does not matter," he sighed, and Naruto arched an inquisitive eyebrow. "What the world needs is someone to save it from this curse," he said. Knowing the truth, Naruto grinned and said, "And what is this so-called curse that the world desperately needs saving from?" Without hesitation, Itachi replied, "Shinobi are what the world needs to be saved from. And I will save this world from the shinobi who plague it." Naruto grinned as he stood and walked across the distance to Itachi. "On one condition," he said, smirking. "On one condition." Itachi looked at the blonde in confusion. "You are right," he said, admitting. "I am the person you believe me to be." Itachi's heart felt lighter the moment that sentence left his mouth, despite the fact that he had known for weeks. Was this the Rikudo Sennin, really? Naruto concluded. "You helped me save it," and Itachi's countenance returned to its typical stoicism until a rare smirk appeared. "Hi, Senin-sama," Itachi said after he nodded. Two of the most tranquil men in the world had recently teamed up and were prepared to begin their mission. It was unclear whether their goal would be world dominance or world peace because either of them understood what would actually save it, but they would work it out together. Underscore 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 Naruto had just celebrated his 7th birthday. 6 months had passed since he and Itachi first met, and a lot had changed. One of the most significant was that Naruto no longer viewed ninjutsu as a terrible deformity. Itachi had ensured that. The godlike man, or was he a child, apparently? Judged the ninja techniques. Too soon, he only had a basic knowledge of ninjutsu, and while refusing to join the academy was, at least in his mind, a smart idea, he had limited his learning ability. Itachi decided to correct that, teaching him everything there was to know about the art of shinobi techniques, apparently, and this had even brought a small smile to his face. There was the creation of Iryo ninjutsu, medical ninjutsu. Itachi explained it as a branch of ninjutsu that was associated with healing, something used by medical nin. That had been the day he had decided that it wasn't ninjutsu that was corrupt, it was the shinobi that used it. Ninjutsu was just an inevitable evolution, a secondary means of understanding the world, a lesser, more complicated and confusing means, but a means nonetheless. Itachi had helped him look at it in a more logical, albeit somewhat figurative, way. He started to look at ninjutsu as the assassin's blade, not the assassin, it was the effect, not the cause, and he was a little embarrassed that he hadn't seen it from the beginning, with his logic, the Jinchuriki. Oh, he still very much loathed that title, were the Bija they housed, not separate, sentient beings of life. He sighed as he thought about how much he needed to begin his journey and how much he missed his other children, who were still waiting for him, ready to be set free, and unaware that he was back among them. The INBU, which he had dubbed the Zoo, an appropriate moniker for such an absurd agency, was wearing a white porcelain mask that some might say looked like a cat. "It's not going to be that bad, kid," he sighed. This was a dreadful scenario. If it could be called that, he had sighed because he missed his imprisoned, mistreated, misunderstood, beautiful children, and he had huffed because he didn't think this purple-haired lady's mask looked like a cat. If someone had said that he lacked imagination, he would have immediately pointed to the sky and yelled, "I created the one thing that was direly needed for the night time, the moon, you moronic mortal." He would never say that, of course, for one reason. He was a priest and a sage, and he needed to have self-control lest he accidentally lash out at someone and end an innocent life. He also believed that he was human, even though he knew that he was powerful. If he implied that he was not mortal, mortals would refer to him as something divine, something not human, and that would only aggravate him. What else was a giant supposed to do with mice? "I know, Nico-san," Naruto said. He wasn't nervous or anxious about this so-called great meeting at all. Before the first human born with the ability to wield chakra, the fire daimyo was just another ordinary, unimpressive man. It wasn't cockiness or arrogance that made him see it that way, it was fact. Nico didn't respond because he didn't think it was important, and they strolled in pleasant silence. The ANBU operative, such an official-sounding title, came to him a little over 4 minutes ago, Apparently, the fire daimyo had finally decided to grace Kanahigakure no Sato with his presence, and Naruto had to drop everything he was doing, which was speaking with his only friend of this era, Uchiha Itachi, in his home, and show up for some meeting that was supposed to decide the fate of his shinobi career. He never before thought the people of the village were so stupid. They actually believed they could force him to do anything. The very thought made him scoff. He hadn't been sitting around, idly chit-chatting with Itachi for 6 months. He had been training, growing stronger, both physically and spiritually. His eyes were maturing much faster than they had in his first life, whether that was due to his past experience, or his new body's almost scary compatibility with just about everything. He had discovered, and this had really shocked him, that his new body was even more compatible with his children than his past body was. His chakra and very soul could resonate with Biju chakra. It was spectacular. He could be with his children on a level they couldn't reach before. Once they were back with him, safe and sound, they would enter that plane of existence together, Nico said. "We are here, Uzumaki-san," as they arrived at the Hokage Tower next to the Shinobi Academy. "You may enter, they have been waiting for you," she said, bowing her head slightly in a courteous gesture that startled him. Most people didn't like him because of his innermost thoughts, so it was nice to see someone who wasn't blind. "Hi," he said, nodding his head in return. "Thank you, Nico-san." With a last nod, the feline agent disappeared in a whirlpool of leaves and wind. With a sigh, Naruto pushed the tower's door open and stepped inside the building with a hint of annoyance. This was a waste of his time. He had no interest in politics or shinobi affairs, and he wasn't going to abandon his beliefs after a single, inconsequential encounter with a single, inconsequential man. These people thought they were much more than they actually were. They weren't the world's top dogs, or kings of the land. Instead, they were corrupt thinkers, men, if they could be classified as such, and women who preyed the weak and cloaked the world in misery and darkness. He inhaled deeply to clear his mind of such resentful, bitter thoughts. He then took his second, third, fourth, and so on steps inside the building, moving slowly as he made his way to the area where he knew these so-called high-ranking officials were waiting for him. He couldn't help but wonder if these individuals would still act as though they owned him if they believed they understood even a small portion of the power he wielded. Would they continue to act as though he were their property, and that they could and would make the decisions that affected his life? He considered showing them the actual, unadulterated power his eyes carried because it was nearly so funny. He was aware of the plan for today, but he didn't like it. He didn't like lying or keeping things secret unless it was for the greater good, and his identity was one of those times. This was clearly another one of those times, but he still didn't like it. It was important to their plan, though, and he wouldn't put his kids' happiness ahead of his own convictions. He smiled at that as well because he was actually his father's child. He shook his head as he turned a corner, his famous eyes wandering the hall in front of him. The walls were tannish white, the floor was brown, and the lights were nearly yellow. The hallway was adorned with pictures of famous ninja who had given their lives, and the lives of others, he might add, to save their village. His father had been the one instance, the one exception where bloodshed had been the right and only way to bring about peace. He had no other options, and he hadn't been proud of the massacre he was praised for. It was an ugly, heartbreaking necessity, one that wasn't made without careful consideration of all other options. When he stopped at a big, elaborate door, he took a moment to gather his thoughts and get ready before knocking. After waiting a short while, the door opened and a man with a rough face, shoulder-length hair, black hair, and an unlit cigarette in his mouth greeted him. "Oh, so you're Uzumaki Naruto," the man said indifferently. "Daimyo-sama, the boy is here," the man said, wearing what appeared to be either civilian clothing or truly unprotected shinobi gear. Naruto turned to see the white cloth hanging from his waist that had the kanji for fire on it. A voice within the room said, "Asuma-san, let the boy in." When Asuma, who had just been given his new name, turned to let Naruto in, he looked sheepish. "Sorry about that, kid," Asuma said, and Naruto simply nodded, not really thinking about who called him a kid, who was literally 1,000 years younger than him. Numerous eyes of all colors greeted Naruto as he entered the room. The normally spacious meeting room appeared cramped with everyone who had come to see the Rinnegan child, as they started to call him, as if he were nothing more valuable than his eyes. Shinobi tended to crave power rather than the force that used it, and as was customary in the shinobi world, you took anything from someone you wanted. It was filthy and disgusting. The Hokage said, "Naruto-kun," with a melancholy grin, not anticipating the barrage of chatter that would follow. Another thing that changed over the course of the 6 months was that Naruto nodded back with a small smile of his own. He had become closer to the Hokage, which was strange in retrospect because the Hokage was a leader of the very thing he detested, shinobi. In addition to leading them, he was one of them, an elderly one who had committed the very dark acts that broke his heart. However, there was also something different about the Sandaime. He wished for peace, but not out of inherent purity but rather because of suffering. He had witnessed with his own eyes and with his own hands the deed that fueled the circle of hatred. He was exhausted, weary of all the hate, all the loss, and Sarutobi Hiruzen wanted peace. Unfortunately, none of that conversation would be tolerated in the shinobi world in which they resided. He wore the robes of the Fire Daimyo, the ruler of Hai no Kuni, and even that great Kanehigakure no Sato belonged to him. In the shinobi world, he was a powerful figure, and it was just as ridiculous as the idea of people who were treated harshly obeying every word of the very people who despised them. "So this is the child, is it?" an elderly, unimpressive man asked in a shrill voice. "Ah, I see the feigned eyes," he squealed in childish delight, and his voice was somewhat annoying and unpleasant to the ears. This Fire Daimyo was more akin to the court jester, a humorous joke of a man. Naruto laughed. If he so desired, he could literally destroy the entire planet, or enslave it, for that matter, with a single blink, or at least he could before he left. Of course, he would need to train more and mature his eyes more before he could amount to that again, but it was only a matter of time. "I value my eyes, but I do not think they make me anything more than any other person," he said. His eyes gave him the ability to fall nations in a blink, and he was reminded of his father. "Ah, such a humble boy!" the so-called powerful man exclaimed, jumping up in his opulent chair a little like a child seeing a toy they wanted to have. He then giggled some more before posing another question. "And why, oh humble child, do you see yourself that way?" he asked with pure excitement. The creator of Nishu was always fair when he first walked the earth, even though he had the ability to be so. He believed that if you abused your power, corruption would take hold of you, and that arrogance and a desire for even more power were the only things that would lead to your inevitable downfall. Even now, in a time when abusing power and being selfish was the norm, he maintained his beliefs. Thinking of himself as superior to other people was a catalyst and a path that led to the shinobi ways. He replied candidly, "I do not wish to become like you," to the daimyo's perplexed stare. A greedy, lustful man who cares for nothing but power, he continued. With a seer on his face, another guy in pricey-looking robes leaped to his feet and yelled, "How dare you!" before taking a breath to scream once more. He was stopped, though, when the daimyo raised his hand and interrupted him. "Ah, Michi-san, please let the boy speak his mind," he said, bursting into another round of laughter. "Please do elaborate, Naruto-kun." He gestured extravagantly with his hand to go on. Naruto sighed, perplexed by the man's strange behavior, but he went on to explain. If history has proven anything, aside from the fact that humans are incapable of maintaining peace, is that every king has fallen, every grand nation has crumbled, sooner or later. The fire daimyo nodded, indicating that he had understood thus far. The reason for this is simplistic in nature, but it is always the truth, always the reason. He continued, at some point, either the nation or the king, or both, begin to crave more, what they have begins to become not enough, and that is the genesis of their downfall. The man he had been summoned to speak with thought for a moment before nodding. The lust, the want for more, even though what was perfectly enough, is the spark that always sends the great kingdoms into oblivion, he said. Ah, so you base your humbleness on the historic theory that hunger falls kings? The fire daimyo asked in a high-pitched voice that suggested he thought he had just said a hook, line, and sinker. The fire daimyo giggled again, giving him a look that made him uneasy. Are you implying that you are a king, Naruto-kun? He asked. It is the very reason you believe that I see myself as a king that I do not wish to be like you. Naruto sighed. The man looked at him curiously, so he continued. Your power-hungry mind looks for more power. Whether it be in the physical world or even in speech patterns, you look for it, even if it is on a subconscious level. He didn't care that he was only 7 years old at the time. This conversation would determine his future no matter how much he tried to deny it. I hadn't implied, even in the slightest, that I see myself as a king, he said. But your reasoning behind your answer was that a king, or nation, falls for its lust for more. How can't you see why it would seem? That's just it. You took my example at face value. You didn't even try to understand the true meaning behind it. He sighed, halting when he saw the blonde-haired boy shake his head and laugh. The meaning wasn't to compare myself to a king, but to explain to a man who sees himself as king that his craving for power that doesn't belong to him could be the end of him. Hiruzen narrowed his eyes, furious that he was powerless to stop the man's hateful, repulsive remarks. Michi, the burly man who had previously stood and yelled at him, stood again, pointing an accusing finger at him. Is that a threat, boy? He yelled, turning to face the Hokage. Hokage-dano, you should tighten the leash around your pet before he pushes his luck, he said. He was so upset that he could only laugh at the fact that he could end the man's life, even with his power not at its full strength, and how very easy it would be. He laughed at the fact that, once his children were with him, they would help him decide everyone's fate. He also laughed at the fact that he was not a man, or child, that killed because he was verbally offended. Leash, that was a snide remark that referred to his son, his caged, imprisoned, and hurt son. Without bothering to add any honorifics, Naruto said, Daimyo, this meeting was to discuss something you wanted to propose, right? Implying that he wanted the discussion to end as soon as possible. He returned to his obnoxious self after he had recovered from the shock of the boy's words, which actually made sense. Ah, yes, he said, laughing. Naruto-kun, I understand that you do not wish to join the Shinobi Academy in Konoha, he said, nodding briefly so the man could continue. Ah, yes, well, he started. I would like to formally invite you to join. In order to stop the man, Naruto held up a hand. Whatever you are offering, I respectably decline, he said. Hiruzen sighed. He knew this was going to happen. I've actually decided to become a shinobi, he said, causing the Hokage's eyes to widen. Naruto turned to the elderly Sarutobi and said, Hokage-sama, adding the honorific knowing that it wouldn't really bother the daimyo, but Michi. I will join the shinobi ranks, on one condition, he said. After a few blinks, Hiruzen cleared his throat and said, And what is the condition, Naruto-kun? No matter how much power he figuratively possessed, he could not force someone born in Konoha to join his bodyguards. This was the one rule he had to follow, and the fire daimyo was speechless, hanging his head down to pout childishly for not getting what he wanted. He wasn't a fool, which would have shocked anyone who had ever met him. He knew how the deal with his shinobi village worked. They let him make it look like he was the top dog if he gave them the right money, and in exchange, they would protect him and his capital. So now that the boy was crying shinobi, he could no longer claim him. Uchiha Itachi, Naruto said, grinning before responding to the question. I will become a shinobi as long as Uchiha Itachi is my sensei. Yes, he detested dishonesty. After a good minute of contemplation, Hiruzen asked, And why do you specifically request Uchiha Itachi? He knew that Itachi was one of his most devoted, not to mention talented, operatives, but the entire Uchiha crisis made his old, weary mind wary. Hiruzen was silent for a while, his analytical mind running through several scenarios at a rate that would make a Nara blush. Naruto closed his eyes and inhaled deeply. He was most shocked by this transformation that had taken place in the last 6 months. While sparring with Itachi, he requested to examine the young Anbyu's dojutsu because he understood it was a dark ability that Indra was born with and that one had to endure a great deal of loss in order to acquire the amazing powers the Sharingan possessed. As usual, Itachi complied and triggered his clan's curse. When the crimson, three-tomo Sharingan's eyes met the purple, ringed Rinnegan's, something inside the blonde awoke. For a brief moment, Naruto was overcome by a searing, breathtaking pain that made his eyes burn like the sun. When he eventually managed to open his eyes, Itachi fell to his knees, his arms growing limp, and tears streaming from his now black eyes. To had opened his eyes, Itachi had seen the, in a single word, impossible.